Okay, I also want to thank John Lieber for organizing this and for the great conference theme. It captures two of my main interests, which are food systems in transition and a genuinely sociological perspective, and using that to make sense of what's going on, which in my mind is what an Eliasian understanding is. So, when it comes to food, whether we have a craving or making a grocery list or planning dinner, food is often on our minds, as many of you have noted, but perhaps not in the ways it should be given the times. It recently occurred to me that people give extraordinary amounts of attention to backing up their data, their contacts, their photos, and they go to extreme lengths to do so. But they don't have much of a clue where their next meal comes from, and are really not taking many steps to ensure future next meals, despite the big to-do about food in recent years due to shortages, availability concerns, and skyrocketing prices. From what I can tell, very few people are aware of the imminent changes to our food system, some of them already happening, some of them unfolding, as a result of environmental, energy, economic, and equity crises of various sorts. So the main point I want to make today is to highlight the dangers of this very limited view and to suggest another way of looking at food systems that can help us understand what's happening and why, and that can point us to some reasonable responses. In a short presentation, I can't offer a lot of detailed answers, obviously, but I hope to give some broad suggestions informed by Eliasian sociology about how we should be studying food systems. So if you want to make sense of our global food system and you were to go looking for a map, chances are you would find something like this. Some maps depict general categories of processes, or you might find something like this, which tries to capture all possible factors. There's another version of that here. Depending upon your goals, they can both be helpful in some ways. The process ones, showing us what's going on, highlight potential trouble spots, but they don't give us much of a sense of how things are likely to change. The factor ones convey the many, many things which affect and are affected by our food system, but they are generally hideously complex, too much to take in, difficult to read. They tend to lack order. While there might be arrows to depict certain flows, key relationships in time and space are left unaddressed. And they tend to operate more as a laundry list, which can be good for helping us see what's there, but not very helpful for showing us where the problems lie, what is likely to happen, or what we could or should do differently. And of course, when I say problems with the food system, I'm talking about many things: access and food security, energy, productivity, health, power, prices, soil, climate change, and more. There's a lot going on here. And there are a lot of smart people on the job, but they tend to look only at limited parts of the system, of this vast food landscape. Please enjoy my celery forest and broccoli mountains and so forth. I couldn't resist playing around with this theme a little bit. So we can see this in recent coverage of food systems. I'm going to quickly run through just a few recent articles about food crises and system change and some of the highlights of what they cover. So for example, in politics, the focus tends to be on policy, international relations, and trade. So you can see I've just excerpted some of the themes and the main conclusions here, the things they talk about. Economists tend to end up focusing on financing schemes and loans, mostly ending up talking about ways to pay for business as usual, right? How can we keep things going the way they're going? And then in the realm of tech and entrepreneurship, it's usually about sexy new technologies, how can we appeal to new investors, and responding to consumer demand. So in short, there's a lot of concern and interest, there's lots of expertise, but taking the usual approach confined to specialized disciplines and so forth, they can't always see the forest for the trees. So through their narrow lens, they tend to miss a lot. In my experience, it's pretty hard to find anyone who's seeing the whole picture, the socio-environmental picture, as I might call it. And so those of us inclined to do so can have a hard time making sense of it all. If you think about just ordinary citizens, non-researchers, non-experts, most people in our modern technological industrial societies have little to no idea where their food comes from. It comes from the store, right? And poll after poll confirm this. And I haven't looked deeply into this, but I think the UK compares fairly well to the US on this front, from what I can tell. So it's not their fault. How could they know in a system where they're very distant from the sources of their food and where the parts, processes, and relationships are mostly unseen, or at least not discoverable without great effort? So the point here is that both types of limited views have very serious consequences. They leave us unaware of the food-related crises unfolding before us, oblivious to the root causes of our problems, which keep our attention focused on the wrong culprits and pursuing strategies that don't actually address the problem. And most of all, this leaves us unprepared to be able to steer our food systems away from disaster and towards something better, which is what these transitions are all about. So it's certain that in the not so distant future, our food systems will look very different than they do today. And this is only news to those who have little working knowledge of the complex pathways by which food reaches most people in industrialized nations and all of the various processes it depends on. So as I mentioned, it's not easy to discern the workings of these very obscure systems. However, we can begin to see some aspects of them more clearly when we zoom out a bit, expanding our view in time, when we learn to recognize the multiple, dynamic, and interdependent contexts in which food production and consumption are embedded. I would argue especially the biophysical, which is most often ignored. And when we loosen our emotional attachments to certain familiar or comfortable ways of doing things. To me, these qualities are what characterize an Eliasian approach to studying food in the 21st century. So this is the very kind of approach I've tried to capture. Here's the flowchart warning. This is the approach I've tried to capture in a general sociological theory, or what I've been calling the socio-environmental synthesis framework. It tries to convey the basic pattern of socio-environmental processes by way of identifying a small number of key principles. So rather than an endless list of factors or variables, like this image we saw before, I've enlarged some text so you can see what's included in this diagram. And this approach, this sort of variable-centered approach, is what renders society, as Norbert Elias puts it, as a hodgepodge of adjacent but unconnected spheres in which first one and then another is singled out as the true driving force. However, when we zoom out to see the larger pattern, we are reminded that there is an overall order. So, if there are particular impacts of interest, for example, this framework would guide us to note how the impacts we are concerned about stem from individual and collective expressions of habitus, which itself forms, develops, and changes within particular patterns of social bonds of interdependence, all of which emerge from, depend on, and happen within certain biophysical conditions. So there's a basic order of conditioning influences happening here, although much is happening at the same time. And in studying these, one can enter at any point. And if we extend this basic idea out over time, noticing how one moment necessarily emerges from previous and feeds into the next, this helps us understand the overall pattern of change. That sounds like such a simple idea, but I want to stress what a significant development this is in the academic realm that I've been working in, where at least according to decades of researchers complaining about the absence of a reliable theory of social change, we desperately need a reliable understanding of this pattern, especially with regard to making the socio-environmental transitions needed today. So when it comes to food, the best we usually get is a kind of wish list, or studies that perhaps make some claims about the statistically significant relationships between certain factors. But there's little reliable sense of how to best study food systems, how to anticipate likely scenarios and outcomes, or how it might be possible to guide those systems in a better direction. On the other hand, I argue, when we use the Elias-inspired socio-environmental framework to think about food systems, a series of useful questions emerge for doing all of those things. So I just want to walk us through 3 of those different functions of this framework. So if we want to study and understand change, let's say we want to explain particular impacts, we can trace them back to the perceptions and practices bringing them about, to the type of habitus they're associated with, the figurational conditions within which that habitus develops, and the biophysical conditions which make that possible. And again, nobody has to study all of these things, but it gives us a way to situate our work. You can use this to project forward, to anticipate likely changes. Now, we already have a pretty good idea of how different impacts are likely to affect biophysical conditions, and maybe how certain impacts could be altered with changes in certain practices. But here we are prompted to also view those practices as stemming from certain qualities of habitus and figurational patterns, and to consider how particular biophysical impacts are likely to affect future figurational patterns. Thirdly, if the goal is to guide social change in a particular direction, probably the most ambitious one here, this model points us to useful questions like, what exactly do we want to change about our impacts? And with that in mind, we ask, what expressions of habitus most contribute to those impacts, and how should those be changed? What kind of overall habitus qualities are needed to support those different expressions? What kind of figurational patterns would support the development of that kind of habitus? And what biophysical conditions would support and sustain all of those desired changes, or any of them? So there's not time to go into the details of how all of these would apply to specific food-related questions, but in terms of just thinking about this one, informing efforts to make change, I want to mention one key contrast between the conventional approach and the one suggested by this framework. So the typical paradigm for making change tends to be one of direct intervention into the problem. For example, let's say a government wants to address poor health related to diet. Examples of conventional responses might be expand access to dietary and lifestyle counseling, right, with the assumption that information leads to behavior change. Or establish a new position in government meant to coordinate efforts to improve food information, dietary habits, and access to healthier food, which betrays our bias toward solving problems by adding more parts and people to the system. Incidentally, these are actually 2 of the 7 recommendations that just came out of the US government this past week. There was a big announcement about they finally realized that our massive health crisis is related to the American diet. And all of their suggestions aren't quite such egregious examples of this kind of direct intervention, but it does characterize the overall approach to this problem. The synthesis framework, by contrast, encourages us to focus on changing the conditions within which problems arise and within which certain possibilities could be realized, many of which trace back to figurational patterns, reminding us of the importance of a sociological understanding. So in helping us step back and see the larger patterns not normally perceptible to us, we get 3 significant benefits. 1, we're able to better see the range of possible entry points into a problem. 2, we can more easily locate where different knowledge, skills, and efforts could best be applied, which could really help us out with the collaboration that everyone is calling for. And 3, it facilitates addressing immediate problems while also helping us to consider how to make long-term change. So the bottom line here is that 21st century food systems will look different. And there are many ways they should look different, starting as soon as possible. To really understand our food systems and how to change them requires a genuinely sociological approach, aka, in my opinion, an Eliasian approach, one that situates social phenomena firmly in their historical and biophysical contexts and brings dynamic interdependence, and therefore change, to the forefront. Overall, doing so helps replace overwhelming complexity with greater simplicity, enabling us to achieve more clarity about the workings of, prospects for, and entry points into addressing the looming crises of 21st century food systems. Thank you.